Welcome to the sixth and final lecture on political economy. In the first 5 lectures, we looked at various economic and political classifications anthropologists use. We looked at subsistence patterns in terms of foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture. In terms of exchange, we looked at reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. And then in terms of political integration, we looked at decentralized forms of political integration in terms of bands and tribes. And then we looked at centralized forms in terms of chiefdoms and states. Then we went on to an important question of how these different classifications line up. We looked at foraging as a subsistence pattern and saw it tended to be tied to the band as a form of political integration and to reciprocal forms of exchange. We also looked at the state level of centralized political integration, how it's tied to agriculture as a subsistence pattern, and redistributive and market forms of exchange. We also looked at the very interesting cases of where the relationship between the politics and economics are far more ambiguous, as a way of trying to figure out some sense of relationships. We took the case of the Newer. In this lecture, we're going to look at horticulture, agriculture, and chiefdoms, and again look at cases of ambiguity. We'll look at the Trobriand Islanders and the Hawaiians. And we'll try and bring it all together in terms of using the holistic perspective and seeing the imperfections of classifications that anthropologists use. When we approach another group of people, how they live, their life ways, we want to have a certain sense of humility in our classifications. We don't want to over-rely on them trying to put everybody into boxes, but use them, and particularly holism, as a tool for understanding others. When we look at horticulture, we're going to look at a chiefdom, and we're going to take the Trobriand Islanders. They live off the coast of Papua New Guinea on a small island with roughly 12,000 people. Most of the island is under cultivation at one time or another, but in 1 year, perhaps only 1/5 of the cultivated land is planted with yams. I'll make 3 points. First, ranking exists among the various matrilineal subclans. There are commoner subclans and chiefly subclans. The chiefly subclans are continually competing one with the other for the highest positions of prestige. Second, headmen exist in most villages. In the commoner villages, they have the power really of a big man that we talked about in the last lecture. In the chiefly subclan villages, the chief is often able to draw separate villages together under his authority. How does he do it? A chief can take more than one wife, and through the marriage payments he collects from these wives, he's able to significantly increase his wealth and act as a center for redistributive exchange. Third, the chief's powers are far from absolute. Basically, people defer to him because of his manipulation of wealth. What we see then among the Trobrianders is that rank combining with marriage alliances allows for the manipulation of certain economic exchanges. And we see further how wealth and prestige derive from these exchanges and leads to political power. We'll look at Hawaii, which is universally viewed as a chiefdom, and see how a combination of shifting dry field horticulture with a regular rotation of dryland taro, sweet potatoes, and bananas combined with intensive agriculture based on irrigation and the growing of taro. So we had horticulture as well as agriculture. I'll make 5 points. First, rank in Hawaiian society was based on 3 hereditary classes: commoners, nobles, and inferiors or kawa. Second, the commoners were by far the most numerous, and they tended to be self-sufficient, but they always had to contribute tribute to the nobles. They were subordinate to them. Third, the nobles were ranked among themselves in degrees of sacredness, and this degree of sacredness was based on descent from the gods, with the highest rank traced to the firstborn child, be it male or female, of the firstborn child of the firstborn child. Fourth, the islands were divided into chiefdoms, each ruled by a paramount chief in a hierarchical pattern with subordinate chiefs under them. Their powers were seemingly absolute and validated by divine right conveyed to them by the gods. The paramount chief's rule was administered and maintained through a cluster of high-ranking nobles who served as priests, counselors, and military leaders below the paramount chief. Below them, in each district of the chiefdom, was ruled by a local chief, and he exacted tribute and channeled much of it up to the paramount chief to support the ruling elite. Fifth, while we might describe the system as feudal in nature, it lacked stability. The system was highly flexible and unstable. A chieftain was established and maintained by conquest. So a chief's power waxed and waned with his military success. The sacred mandate to rule had to be validated continually by secular success in battle for him to maintain his power.
Dr. Borofsky. You are implying that different subsistence patterns often have different forms of political integration. Did Hawaii have two different forms of political organization, one where Hawaiians practiced horticulture and another where they practiced agriculture?
A good question. As far as I know, the same basic system of hierarchical chiefs occurred throughout the Hawaiian archipelago. Often a high chief controlled an island. In the case of Oahu, that would have meant control over both the western or drier side, where horticulture was common, and the eastern or wetter side, where irrigation and agriculture were common. Essentially within the same island, there was little space for vastly different political structures given the competition for land. One system tended to dominate. But according to Kirsch, the competition for land on the drier west side of Oahu may have led to the stratification that spread throughout the whole island. I do not know whether this would be all true for other islands in the archipelago, but I suspect so. We've seen then that there are two fairly defined poles. We have foraging, reciprocity, and bands at one end, and agriculture, redistribution, and market exchange with states at the other. But in between these two poles is far more ambiguous. If we look at the middle zone of types of productions and types of political organization, pastoralists and horticulture with shades of agriculture, or in terms of tribes and chiefdoms, we get a jumble. Divisions don't neatly line up one with the other. The standard divisions for political organization, I would suggest to you, are relatively recent. They stem from a book written by Service, written in 1962. There is much overlap between these middle categories. And we have to ask, why have the standard categorizations of four types of production and four types of political organization that is in most anthropology textbooks? It's really a continuum. You have these two poles, and then you have a continuum between them on the middle ground. I'm suggesting, in other words, that one of the values of holism is moving beyond the desire to classify things into neat boxes. We should focus on better understanding the groups themselves and how all these various structures work together. Once again here, we have used anthropological tools, especially comparison and contextual analysis, to better understand not only how other people live their lives, but how anthropology can best describe them. It brings the insights of Morgan's broad comparisons, Boas' historical particularism, Harris's cultural ecology, and Marcus and Fisher's postmodernism, all together that we drew on when we discussed the historical webcast.
Dr. Borofsky, I have a question. I get your point, that in some cases forms of political integration overlap with certain subsistence patterns, especially in respect to bands, foraging, and states agriculture. But aren't you missing an important point? It strikes me to be rather important to look at the stability of various systems through time and labeling them one way or another. You referred to the Kachin of Burma. Don't many forms of political integration change, and shouldn't anthropologists stress this point?
A very interesting question. In my early response to the question on the flexibility of political structures in Highland Burma, I believe it was in the second lecture of the webcast on political economy, I emphasized that anthropological thinking about political organization derives from the fact that anthropology developed in the West following the rise of nation states, and that these nation states use certain ideological affirmations, the stability of the state through time, and the unity of values of people within the nation state, to strengthen the state. Anthropologists tend to carry the same nation-state perspective into the locales that they studied, often emphasizing the stability and long-enduring nature of the political structures they encountered. But there's really no reason to believe this. There is another reason, however, that they tend to focus on stability over flux. The groups anthropologists visited frequently had little written history. As a result, they had to infer what the past might have been like, and not unreasonably, they assumed the past was somewhat like the present. In my opinion, Political structures often change through time. There is no reason to assume they are stable. Even the American government has changed tremendously in the last 200 years. The executive branch has far more power today over the whole government than in George Washington's time. Change is far more common, I believe, than stability.